Poor woman. Married a security guard, not knowing. He was a real millionaire CEO. The smell of fried chicken and grilled burgers filled the air, mingling with the sound of chatter and laughter echoing through the food court at Lenox Square Mall in Atlanta. Ella Carter wiped her brow with the back of her hand as she stood behind the counter of Grill King, her part-time job that paid just enough to keep her and her 16-year-old brother Jamie afloat. Her long shift was nearing its end, but the exhaustion weighed heavily on her slender frame. "Order 87, Ella called out, placing a tray of steaming fries and a double cheeseburger onto the counter. A customer hurried forward, barely muttering thanks before walking off. She sighed, her voice raspy from hours of calling orders. Her co-worker Linda, a cheerful older woman with a motherly air, nudged her gently. "You've been quiet all day, sugar. What's got you so down?" Ella gave her a tired smile. "It's nothing. Just the usual. Bills piling up, Jamie's tuition, rent overdue. You know how it is." Linda shook her head, her face softening. "You're too young to carry all this weight. Jamie's lucky to have a sister like you." Ella glanced at the clock. 5 more minutes until her shift ended. She could practically feel the ache in her feet, demanding relief. "Thanks, Linda," she said softly. "I'm just trying to keep us going." As the mall began to thin out, Ella finally untied her apron and grabbed her worn denim jacket from the back room. She stepped into the crisp evening air, the bustling sounds of the city beyond the mall humming in the distance. Her mind raced with worries. How would she cover next month's rent? Could she convince her landlord to wait a little longer? Ella's thoughts were interrupted when she saw a group of rowdy teenagers harassing an elderly janitor near the entrance. They laughed as one of them kicked over his mop bucket, spilling dirty water onto the tiled floor. Anger flared in her chest. "Hey!" she called out, marching toward them. "Leave him alone!" The teenagers turned to look at her, their smirks faltering. "Mind your business, lady," one of them muttered, but they shuffled off, their bravado deflated. Ella helped the janitor upright his mop bucket. "You okay?" she asked gently. He nodded, offering her a grateful smile. "Thank you, miss." Not many would step in like that. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with a man in a security uniform. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair slightly tousled beneath his cap. His sharp green eyes met hers, and for a moment she felt a flicker of embarrassment. "Good timing," he said, his voice steady but warm. "You handled that well." Ella shrugged, trying to brush it off. Someone had to. People shouldn't treat others like that. "Not everyone would step up," he replied, a hint of admiration in his tone. "I'm Jake, by the way. Jake Morgan." "Ella," she said, offering a small smile. "You're the mall security." Jake nodded, glancing at the janitor to make sure he was okay before turning back to her. "Yeah, part-time. Helps me stay busy." Ella noticed the faint laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, as if he smiled often. "Well, thanks for showing up. I'm sure the janitor appreciated it." "I think you handled it better than I would have," Jake said with a chuckle. "You're braver than most." Ella felt her cheeks flush slightly. She wasn't used to compliments, especially from strangers. "Just doing what's right," she said, shifting her weight. "Anyway, I should get going. Long day." Jake hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. Finally, he stepped aside, giving her space to pass. "Take care, Ella." She nodded and walked away, the sound of his voice lingering in her mind longer than she expected. At home, Ella unlocked the door to their small 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of Decatur. The space was modest, with thrift store furniture and second-hand appliances, but she kept it clean and organized. Jamie was sitting at the kitchen table, his textbook spread out in front of him. "You're late," he said without looking up. "Sorry," Ella replied, setting her bag down. "Got caught up at work." Jamie finally looked up, his brow furrowed. "You've been working too much. You're going to burn out." She smiled, ruffling his hair as she passed. "Don't worry about me. How's the math homework?" "Terrible," Jamie grumbled, pushing his notebook toward her. Can you check this? I think I messed up the equations. Ella sat beside him, leaning over the paper. For a while they worked together in the quiet comfort of their kitchen, her worries momentarily pushed aside by the steady rhythm of solving problems. That night, as Ella lay in bed, she thought about Jake Morgan. There was something about him, his calm demeanor, the way he had looked at her like she mattered. It was a fleeting moment, she told herself. Nothing more. But in the stillness of her room, with the city lights glowing faintly through the curtains, she couldn't help but wonder if fate had more in store for her than she realized. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains of Ella's bedroom, casting a warm glow across the modest space. She groaned softly as she stretched, the aches from yesterday's long shift still clinging to her limbs. There was no time to linger, though not when bills were piling up and Jamie's tuition deadline was just weeks away. Pulling herself out of bed, she shuffled into the kitchen, where Jamie was already eating a bowl of cereal. His thick-rimmed glasses sat crooked on his nose as he scrolled through his phone, occasionally spooning cereal into his mouth. "Morning," she said, forcing a smile. "Morning," he replied without looking up. "You have work today?" "Of course," Ella said, opening the fridge and surveying the sparse contents. She grabbed a yogurt cup and sat across from him. "What about you? Got any big tests coming up?" "Yeah, but it's fine. I'm ahead on studying," Jamie said, pushing his glasses up. He glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "But you need to stop working so much. I can get a part-time job, you know." Ella shook her head firmly. "You focus on school. That's the deal, remember? You're going to college, Jamie, and I'm going to make sure of it." Jamie sighed, but didn't argue. They both knew the weight Ella carried, but there was no changing her mind. Later that day, Ella found herself once again behind the counter at Grill King, the familiar rhythm of taking orders and flipping burgers filling her hours. It was a reprieve. In some ways, a chance to drown out her worries in the hum of the fryers and the chatter of the food court. Just as she was finishing up a particularly large order, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the counter. Jake Morgan, dressed in his security uniform, was leaning casually against a nearby pillar, his green eyes watching her with a small smile. "Hey," he said when she finally looked his way. "Hey," Ella replied, slightly breathless from the rush. "What brings you by?" "Don't tell me you're patrolling Grill King for suspicious activity." Jake chuckled, his easy demeanor instantly putting her at ease. "Not quite. I was in the area and thought I'd check in on the hero from the other night." Ella rolled her eyes, though a faint blush crept up her cheeks. "I'm no hero, just someone who can't stand bullies." "Well, either way, you handled it better than most," Jake said, his tone sincere. "Mind if I sit while you finish up?" She nodded toward the nearest table. "Go ahead. I'll be done in a few." When her shift ended, Ella joined Jake at the table, tugging her jacket over her uniform. He had a coffee cup in front of him and was leaning back in his chair, looking completely at ease. "Rough day?" he asked. "They're all rough," Ella admitted, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But I'm used to it." Jake nodded thoughtfully, as if weighing his next words. "You work hard." "It's obvious." Ella shrugged. "You do what you have to do, right? It's not like life hands you an easy option." Jake tilted his head slightly. "What if it did?" She blinked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I have an idea a bit unconventional, but it might help us both." Ella's brow furrowed. "Jake, what are you talking about?" "Well," he began carefully, "my grandmother Evelyn has been on my case about settling down. She's old-fashioned, and she wants me to get married. I've been putting her off for years, but lately she's been persistent." Ella stared at him, unsure of where this was going. "Okay. And what does that have to do with me?" Jake hesitated, his gaze steady. "What if we got married?" Her jaw dropped. "What?" "Just hear me out," Jake said quickly. "It doesn't have to be real, just a marriage on paper to get my grandmother off my back. In return, I'd make sure you're taking care of your rent, Jamie's tuition, whatever you need." Ella's mind raced. The idea was absurd, completely insane. But as she looked into Jake's calm, earnest face, a flicker of temptation stirred in her chest. It wasn't just the financial relief he was offering. It was the chance to finally breathe, to stop drowning in the constant weight of survival. "That's crazy," she said, shaking her head. "You barely know me." Jake smiled faintly. "I know enough. You're hard-working, honest, and you've got a good heart. I trust you, Ella." Her heart skipped a beat at the sincerity in his voice. "Jake, I don't even know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," he replied. No pressure. "Just think about it." That night, Ella lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling as Jake's words replayed in her mind. The offer was too good to be true, wasn't it? But the way he had spoken to her, the quiet kindness in his tone, made her believe he was genuine. Still, the idea of marrying someone she barely knew felt reckless, even desperate. Could she really trust Jake? Could she trust herself to make such a life-altering decision? As the city buzzed softly beyond her window, Ella closed her eyes, trying to quiet the storm of thoughts in her head. Tomorrow, she told herself. She'd decide tomorrow, but deep down, she knew the decision had already begun to take root in her heart. The next morning, Ella woke to the pale light of dawn filtering through her thin curtains. Her head throbbed from lack of sleep, her thoughts tangled in the impossible decision Jake had placed before her. She dragged herself out of bed and into the kitchen, where Jamie was pouring cereal into a bowl, still half asleep himself. "Morning," he mumbled. "Morning," Ella replied, her voice heavy. Jamie noticed her tone and glanced up, his eyebrows knitting together. "You okay?" Ella forced a small smile. "Yeah, just tired. That's all." He didn't push her further, but as Ella sat with a mug of coffee and stared at the worn table, she felt the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her more than ever. Rent was due in 2 weeks, Jamie's tuition needed to be paid by the end of the month, and her hours at Grill King weren't enough to cover either. Jake's offer echoed in her mind. It was absurd, yes, but it was also a lifeline, a chance to catch her breath, to give Jamie the future he deserved. But was it worth the risk? Could she trust him? Later that day, as Ella walked to work, she found herself replaying her conversations with Jake. His words, his calm demeanor, his steady green eyes, they all felt genuine. He wasn't pressuring her or making false promises. He was simply offering her a choice. By the time she reached the food court, Ella's decision was starting to solidify in her mind. She couldn't let pride stand in the way of survival. Jamie's future was more important than her reservations. If Jake was willing to help, maybe she should let him. That evening, Ella finished her shift and found Jake waiting near the exit of the mall. He leaned casually against a pillar, his security uniform crisp but relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. When he saw her, he straightened and offered her a small smile. "Hey," he said, his voice warm. "How was your day?" "Busy," Ella replied, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. "Can we talk?" Jake's expression grew serious. "Of course. Let's sit." They found a quiet bench near the fountain in the center of the mall, the sound of trickling water providing a soothing backdrop. Ella folded her hands in her lap, her fingers twisting nervously. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice steady but soft. "And I think I'm willing to give it a shot." Jake's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, his expression encouraging her to continue. "I don't know if this is the right choice," she admitted, "but I don't have many options. If this really is just an arrangement, and if it can help Jamie, then I'm in." Jake exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath. "It is just an arrangement, Ella. No strings attached. We'll figure out the details together, and I'll make sure you're comfortable with everything." His calm, measured tone eased some of the tension in her chest. "Okay," she said, nodding. "Let's do it." The courthouse wedding. A week later, Ella stood outside the Fulton County Courthouse, her nerves buzzing like static. She wore a simple navy dress and a cardigan, her only nice outfit, and clutched a small bouquet of daisies that Jamie had surprised her with that morning. Beside her, Jake looked dapper in a charcoal grey suit, a far cry from his usual security uniform. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low. Ella met his gaze, searching for any trace of doubt or hesitation. She found none. "As ready as I'll ever be." They entered the courthouse, where Ella's best friend Maggie and Jamie were waiting. Maggie enveloped her in a tight hug, her blonde curls bouncing as she pulled back to grin at Ella. "Are you sure about this?" Maggie asked, her tone teasing but with a hint of genuine concern. Ella smiled faintly. "No, but here we are." The ceremony was quick and quiet. The judge, a kind-faced woman with glasses perched on her nose, recited the vows with practiced efficiency. Ella's heart pounded as she repeated the words, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Jake smiled at her, not a smug or triumphant smile, but one of quiet reassurance. Ella felt her breath hitch as he leaned in, pressing a soft, chaste kiss to her cheek. "It's official," he said, his voice warm. "We're partners now." Settling in. That evening, Ella moved into Jake's apartment. It was a modest two-bedroom in a quiet complex on the outskirts of Atlanta, comfortable but unassuming. She was surprised by how neat and organized it was, with simple furniture and warm lighting that made the space feel welcoming. "This is your room," Jake said, opening the door to a guest bedroom that was sparsely furnished but clean. "You can make it your own. Whatever you need, just let me know." Ella nodded, setting her small suitcase on the bed. "Thank you, Jake, for all of this." He shrugged, his tone casual but sincere. "We're a team now. I take care of my team." Over the next few days, they fell into a routine. Jake worked his shifts as a security guard, and Ella continued at Grill King. In the evenings, they shared simple dinners, their conversations growing more comfortable and easy. Jake had a way of making her laugh, of easing the tension that seemed to follow her everywhere. For the first time in years, Ella felt a flicker of hope, a fragile but steady light in the darkness. The first sign. One night, as Ella was unpacking a box in her new room, she noticed a small stack of letters tucked into the corner of a drawer. They were addressed to Jacob Morgan, but the return address caught her eye. Morgan Enterprises headquarters. Her brow furrowed as she flipped through the envelopes, curiosity gnawing at her. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. Why would a security guard receive mail from such a prestigious company? She set the letters aside, her thoughts spinning. Was there more to Jake than he had let on? And if so, what was he hiding? The days following their courthouse wedding were a strange mix of normalcy and tension. Ella found herself settling into Jake's apartment, but every corner of the space felt unfamiliar. The clean, tidy living room that Jake had so thoughtfully furnished, the kitchen stocked with high-end appliances she had never used before, and the guest room she now called her own, all of it felt too perfect for someone like her. Jake was kind and considerate, never pushing her beyond what she was comfortable with. He kept their arrangement clear and simple. But despite his calm demeanor, Ella couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in a world that didn't quite fit. She was playing a role, pretending to be someone she wasn't. Still, there were small moments of warmth that she found herself clinging to. The way Jake always made sure she had a hot cup of tea when she came home after work, or how he took the time to talk to Jamie about his schoolwork. It was these simple gestures that made Ella wonder if she was starting to care about him more than just a convenient arrangement. One evening, after a long day at Grill King, Ella came home to find Jake already in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. The faint smell of garlic and onions filled the air, making her stomach growl. "Hey, you're home early," she remarked, removing her shoes and slipping into the living room. Jake glanced over his shoulder, smiling. "Thought I'd surprise you. You've been working a lot lately." She smiled back, surprised by his thoughtfulness. "You're spoiling me. It's what partners do, right?" he said, his voice light and casual. "Besides, you work hard. You deserve a break." Ella sat at the kitchen counter, watching him prepare the meal. The kitchen was immaculate, every utensil in its place. She envied his ability to keep things in order, to make everything look so effortless. But as she watched him, a question she had been pushing to the back of her mind came to the forefront. "Jake, can I ask you something?" He paused, his knife hovering over the cutting board. "Of course." She hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question. She didn't want to sound paranoid, but her curiosity had been growing for days. "You mentioned your grandmother before. Evelyn, right?" Jake's expression softened, but there was a subtle tension in his jaw. "Yeah, Evelyn. She's old-fashioned, but she means well." "Why?" Ella swallowed, then decided to ask what had been bothering her. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but are you really just a security guard?" Jake put the knife down slowly, turning to face her. His green eyes met hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "You've been thinking about that, haven't you?" She nodded, feeling the weight of her question hang between them. "I've been wondering why someone like you would want to marry someone like me. I know it's supposed to be just a simple arrangement, but it doesn't feel like it. There's something I don't know, Jake." Jake took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. He walked over to her and sat down across from her at the counter. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. "I never meant to deceive you, Ella," Jake finally said, his voice low and steady. "I just wanted someone to see me, not my title, not the company, just me. But I understand why you're asking now." Ella sat forward, her gaze never leaving his. "What do you mean? Who are you, Jake?" He looked away for a moment, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "My name is Jacob Morgan. I'm the CEO of Morgan Enterprises, a tech conglomerate that's grown over the past few years. It's one of the largest companies in the country." Ella's breath caught in her throat. The name Morgan Enterprises was familiar to her, but she hadn't connected it to Jake. "You're the CEO." Jake nodded, his gaze meeting hers again. "Yeah, I guess I've been living two lives, one as Jake Morgan, the security guard, and the other as Jacob Morgan, the CEO. I kept the two separate because, well, people see me differently when they know the truth. I didn't want that with you. I didn't want you to be with me because of my money, my position. I wanted you to be with me because you wanted to be." Ella was speechless, her mind racing. She had known there was something off about Jake's security guard persona, but this was something entirely different. The man she had married was the head of one of the most powerful companies in the country, and she had never seen it coming. Jake reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Ella, I never lied to you. I just kept my personal life separate because I wanted to be sure that whatever you felt for me was real. Not because of my wealth, my name, or the expectations that come with it." Ella blinked, trying to process everything. She had married a billionaire without knowing it. The shock was overwhelming, but as she looked into Jake's earnest eyes, she felt a wave of understanding wash over her. He wasn't just some man hiding behind a facade of money. He was someone who had kept his distance from the world for fear of being misunderstood. I don't know what to say," Ella finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake squeezed her hand. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted to be honest with you, now that we're in this together." That night, after dinner, Ella couldn't sleep. She lay awake, her mind spinning with the weight of everything she had just learned. Jake had given her the truth, and now she had to decide what it meant for their future. Would she accept the man behind the title, the man who had never once asked for her love because of his wealth? Could she reconcile the Jake she had come to know with the powerful billionaire who now stood before her? She didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This marriage was far from ordinary, and her life, her future, was about to change in ways she never expected. The days that followed Jake's revelation passed in a haze for Ella. At work, she moved through the motions, but her mind was elsewhere, swirling with the weight of the truth Jake had finally shared. Each time she looked at him, the man she thought she knew, the man who had been her husband for the past week, She couldn't help but see him through a different lens, a lens of power, of wealth, and of a life she wasn't sure she could belong to. That evening, as they sat together at dinner, the air between them was heavy, the silence punctuated only by the occasional clink of utensils against plates. Jake, ever the gracious host, smiled and asked her about her day, but Ella found it harder than ever to focus on the small talk. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the truth of who he was. They ate quietly, Ella pushing her food around on the plate, her appetite fleeting. She had 1,000 questions swirling in her mind, but no words to speak them. Jake broke the silence first, his voice low, but filled with an undercurrent of concern. "Ella, I know this is a lot. I should have told you sooner. I didn't want to overwhelm you, and I didn't want you to feel trapped." She looked at him, taking in the familiar comfort of his face, but now it seemed so much more distant. "I don't feel trapped," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I just don't know how to handle this. It's a lot to take in, Jake." He nodded slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I get it. It's like I've been hiding a huge part of myself from you, and I shouldn't have. I'm sorry for that." Ella swallowed, feeling the weight of the words she was about to speak. "I don't know what to believe right now. Everything's changed. I don't know if I can trust this version of you." Jake looked as though he had been struck, his expression faltering before he masked it with a practiced composure. "Ella, the man you married is the same one you've been talking to every night, the man who listens to you vent after a bad day, who helps Jamie with his homework, who eats takeout on the couch with you at the end of a long day." Ella's eyes welled with tears she had been holding back. "I know that man, but I don't know the other one, the one who has a company, a fortune, a world I don't understand." Jake's gaze softened, his tone deepening with sincerity. "I understand. It's a lot to ask of you, to adjust so quickly. I've never expected you to love me for my wealth. I just wanted you to see me." She wiped at a tear that had escaped. "But I never asked for this. I never asked to be part of a life that's so far removed from my own. What do you want from me, Jake?" He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table, the light from the kitchen reflecting in his eyes. "I want you to trust me. I want you to see me for who I really am, not just what I have. I'm not asking you to change your life. I just want to be with you, Ella. I want to see where this goes, without the fear of being judged for my name or my bank account." Ella looked at him, her heart heavy. Could she ever truly step into this world? Could she accept a life that was built on a foundation so far removed from her own? The more she tried to picture it, the more she found herself feeling lost, untethered. Later that night, as Ella lay in bed, the sound of the city below her window filled the room, a constant hum of life she had grown used to. Yet tonight, it felt different. The walls felt smaller, the ceiling lower. She was living in a dream that wasn't hers, surrounded by things she didn't understand. Jake's offer, his sincerity, was real. She knew that. But how could she reconcile the man who was part of this corporate empire with the person she had been for years, the waitress trying to scrape together enough to keep her family afloat? There was a vast gulf between their worlds, and no matter how kind Jake was, no matter how much he cared, Ella couldn't help but feel as though they were always going to be on opposite sides of a divide she could never cross. The next morning, Jake left for work earlier than usual, the soft click of the door signaling his departure. Ella had already risen, but her mind was still clouded with doubt. As the hours passed, she busied herself with small tasks, trying to keep her mind off the overwhelming thoughts that swirled in her head. Just before noon, a knock at the door broke her concentration. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, she was greeted by a delivery man holding a large, neatly wrapped box. "Package for Mrs. Morgan," he said, handing her a clipboard to sign for it. Ella blinked in surprise but signed quickly, the box too large to ignore. She closed the door behind her and set it down on the coffee table. Curiosity gnawed at her as she carefully removed the wrapping, revealing a sleek, modern-looking kitchen appliance, an industrial-grade blender, the kind she had once dreamed of owning for her culinary experiments. Inside the box was a small note written in Jake's familiar handwriting. "I know you've been thinking about your future, and I want to help make it happen. This is for you to use when you're ready. No rush, just something I thought you might enjoy." Ella's heart softened as she read the note. She didn't understand Jake's world, didn't know how to fit into it. But the gesture, the thoughtfulness behind it, made her realize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't so different from her after all. She set the note down gently and ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the blender. She could feel Jake's presence in every curve, in the simplicity of the gift. There was something about this moment, something that made her feel that perhaps, despite the vast divide between their lives, they were starting to build a bridge, one small gesture at a time. Days turned into weeks, and the tension that had initially defined Ella and Jake's marriage began to slowly fade. But beneath the surface, the divide between their worlds still existed. Ella found herself caught between the life she had known her struggle, her ambition, and the world Jake had introduced her to, one built on luxury and expectations she didn't yet understand. She hadn't yet figured out where she fit in, but she couldn't deny that she was beginning to feel something else she hadn't anticipated: hope. It was a rainy Tuesday when Ella came home from work to find Jake waiting for her, the apartment warmer than usual, the faint smell of vanilla candles hanging in the air. The sight of him sitting there, his shoes off and his suit jacket casually tossed over the back of the chair, made her pause for a moment. He had changed his approach. It seemed no longer the guarded, distant man who kept his distance for fear of being seen as just his wealth, but someone who was trying to meet her halfway. "Long day?" Jake asked, looking up with a small smile. Ella sighed as she set down her bag, shrugging out of her jacket. "Not too bad, just the usual." "Busy." She crossed the room, but Jake stood up, walking over to her with a look in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. Without saying a word, he gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheek. His touch was comforting, and for the first time in a while, Ella let herself lean into it, allowing her worries to fade for a brief moment. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Jake's voice was gentle, but laced with understanding. Ella nodded, looking down at her feet. "I don't know how to be a part of this world. I don't know how to be a part of your world." Jake's expression softened further. "I don't want you to be a part of my world if it means losing yourself. I never asked for that." She looked up at him, her heart racing. "I don't want to lose myself either," she whispered. "I want you to be you, Ella. Nothing more, nothing less," he said quietly. A few days later, while Ella was cleaning out the small closet in their bedroom, she found something unexpected. In the back of the closet, hidden behind an old coat and a few boxes of items she had yet to unpack, was a leather-bound notebook. It was thick, with pages that looked well worn, and the words "Morgan Enterprises" stamped in gold on the front. Curiosity tugged at her as she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface. Sitting down on the bed, Ella opened the notebook, her eyes scanning the first few pages. They were filled with sketches, architectural blueprints, product designs, even diagrams of company strategies. She turned the pages more quickly, finding pages and pages of ideas, plans, and goals, all neatly organized, but more than that, they were written in Jake's handwriting. She felt a strange tug in her chest as she read through them. There was a side to Jake she hadn't seen, one that revealed his ambition, his passion for his company, and the world he was building. She had always seen him as someone who cared about her, but this was the side of him that had driven him to be the man he was today. Ella felt a deep sense of awe as she realized just how much of himself Jake had hidden, not because he wanted to deceive her, but because he had wanted her to see him for who he was, not for the empire he had built. A few days later, the topic came up again: his past. It wasn't something Jake had discussed openly, but Ella couldn't shake the urge to know more. That evening she sat beside him on the couch, the warmth of the fire in the corner flickering between them. After a moment of silence, she turned to him, her voice soft but insistent. "Jake, I need to know more. About you, about your past. You've shown me so much, but there's still so much I don't understand." Jake looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he let out a slow breath. "You want to know the real reason I kept my distance from all of this? From my family, from the company, from everything?" Ella nodded, her heart in her throat. "Yes." He paused, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "I didn't grow up in this world, Ella. My parents weren't rich, far from it. My mom raised me and my younger brother alone. She worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. My dad? He left when I was young, and I never saw him again. I worked my way through college, taking any job I could find. When I was 23, I got the chance to build something, to create something of my own, and I took it. I never looked back." Ella felt a pang in her chest as she listened to him. She had always assumed that Jake's wealth came from privilege, but hearing his story, the determination in his voice, made her realize just how hard he had fought to get here. Jake continued, his voice softer now. "When I started Morgan Enterprises, I was just trying to survive. And over the years, it became about more than survival. It became about creating something that would last, something that could give back to people who didn't have what I had growing up." Ella reached out, placing her hand on his. "I had no idea," she said softly. Jake smiled, his fingers gently wrapping around hers. "I never wanted anyone to pity me, Ella. Not even you. I wanted you to see me for who I am now, not for where I came from." As the weeks went by, Ella and Jake's relationship began to grow in ways she hadn't expected. They shared moments of quiet intimacy, long walks through the city, dinners where Jake would cook, and they'd laugh about the small things in life. They began to build a connection that felt more real than the arranged marriage that had started it all. But even as they grew closer, Ella knew that there were still walls between them. She hadn't yet found her place in his world, and she wasn't sure she ever would. But something in her had shifted, and for the first time she started to believe that maybe she could try. Maybe she could find a way to navigate this new life without losing the person she had been before. One evening, after an emotional conversation about their future, Jake sat next to Ella on the couch, his arm around her shoulders. "Ella, I need you to know that no matter what happens, I want to build a future with you. It's not about the money or the company. It's about you and me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back, her heart full. "I'm scared, Jake. I don't know if I can fit into your world, but I'm willing to try." Jake kissed her forehead gently. "That's all I ask, Ella. One step at a time." Ella smiled, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. She didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time she wasn't afraid to take the next step. Ella sat in the corner of the cozy apartment, watching the last rays of sunlight slip through the window. The past few months felt like a whirlwind, each day a new chapter in a story she hadn't expected to write. She glanced over at Jake, who was sitting across from her, his eyes focused on the laptop screen as he worked through emails. The glow from the screen illuminated his face, casting shadows that seemed to make him look older, worn by the pressures he carried. She had spent so much time trying to make sense of their world, his world. But tonight, something shifted. Tonight, she stopped trying to control everything, stopped trying to fit herself into a mold that didn't belong to her. She had learned to embrace the parts of herself that didn't fit and accept the parts of Jake's life that she didn't understand. Jake closed his laptop and looked at her, his green eyes softening as he took in her quiet expression. "You okay?" he asked gently. Ella smiled, her lips curling in a way that felt both relieved and determined. "I think I am." The following weekend, Jake took Ella to a gala organized by Morgan Enterprises. It was an extravagant event at a sprawling ballroom in one of the city's most prestigious hotels, but for Ella, it wasn't about the grandeur. It was about the new perspective she had gained, the space she had carved for herself in Jake's world. As they entered the ballroom, Jake's arm around her waist, she could feel the eyes of the crowd on them. She had always felt like an outsider in settings like this, but tonight she wasn't afraid. She was there because she belonged by Jake's side, not because of his wealth, but because they had built something real together. At the reception, as they mingled with his colleagues, she was surprised at how easy it was to talk to people, to find common ground with those she had once thought would never understand her. Jake was always there, offering a gentle hand of reassurance when she needed it, always making sure she felt included. As the evening wore on, Jake pulled her aside to a quieter part of the balcony, the city lights sparkling below them. "Ella," he said, his voice soft but filled with meaning, "I've never wanted anyone to change for me, but I've learned that love isn't about changing who you are. It's about growing together, no matter the differences. You've done that with me, and I want to keep doing that with you." Ella felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent so much time trying to fight the life she found herself in, but now, in this moment, with the cool night air surrounding them and Jake's steady presence beside her, she realized how much she had grown. She wasn't the same person who had walked into this marriage a few months ago, unsure and guarded. She was stronger now, more confident, and more open to the possibilities ahead. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm ready to try. I'm ready to be with you, Jake. All of me." Jake smiled, his hand brushing against hers as he kissed her forehead gently. "That's all I've ever wanted, Ella. Just you. A promise." As the gala came to a close, they stepped out into the cool evening air, the quiet hum of the city beneath them. Jake's hand found hers, and together they walked to the car waiting for them. But this time there was no fear in her step, no hesitation. She had made her decision, and for the first time she felt like she was truly stepping into the future, one where they would face whatever came together. The next few months flew by in a blur of new beginnings. Ella enrolled in a culinary program at Le Cordon Bleu in Atlanta, a dream she had long given up on, but now was within reach. She and Jake continued to build their life together, one small, meaningful step at a time. She learned to navigate his world, not by changing who she was, but by bringing her own strengths and passions into it. Jake, for his part, supported her every step of the way. When she opened her first restaurant, Ella's Table, he stood by her side through the challenges, encouraging her when things got tough and celebrating with her when she reached new milestones. He had created an empire, but he was proud of the one they were building together. One quiet afternoon, as they sat in the park with Jamie, who had finally received a scholarship to attend college, Ella realized just how far they had come. Her heart swelled with pride as she watched Jamie laugh with Jake, their bond growing stronger each day. Turning to Jake, she took his hand, her fingers intertwined with his. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Jake smiled, his eyes filled with love. "We have. And the best part is, we're just getting started." Ella leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. In that moment, everything felt right. She had found her place in his world, not by trying to change who she was, but by embracing both the complexities and the simple joys that came with being together. Together, they had created a life that was theirs alone, one built on trust, growth, and the love that had always been there, waiting to flourish. As the dust settled and their lives slowly came into focus, Ella realized that the journey she had embarked on with Jake wasn't about wealth or status. It was about trust, growth, and learning to love the person standing beside you. Together, they had faced the obstacles that came with their different worlds and found a place for each other in the midst of it all. What started as an unexpected marriage had blossomed into something real and lasting. If you were captivated by their journey and the twists along the way, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love, resilience, and unexpected turns. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next story. Thank you for watching.